Well, I'm Michelle Easton, the president and founder of Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women. So when I founded it, the question was what to name this organization, and started looking through history for the names of distinguished women who were no longer living, and it was really no contest. There were a couple, but there was nobody like Mrs. Luce, who had this incredible professional career, who had deep faith, who had a love of family, who had such knowledge and experience in the conservative issues that young women are mostly concerned about today. So it was really no contest. Well, she was a remarkable woman. She was born in 1903 and passed away in 1987, had a rich, incredible life. Her achievements are monumental considering the time when she lived. I mean, when you think about the fact that when she was 13, that was the first woman served in Congress ever when she was 13. When she was 16, women got the right to vote. So it was a very different country, a very different life for women in America back then. She was raised in a family under fairly difficult financial circumstances. Her father had left the family, Mrs. Luce, her brother, and her mother, and they struggled some, but she achieved so much more than you would have expected for a young woman in that time coming from that kind of background. She read extensively, she learned to be a fabulous writer, and very, very impressive speaker, and had so many achievements in her life. She had just had an unsuccessful first marriage. It seems that her first husband, who her mother had selected for her, was an alcoholic, and it was a very difficult marriage. So when that ended, she could have sat fat and happy with what she received at the end of the marriage, but she really wanted to do something. So she was at a party in New York, and she met Condé Nast, who was a magazine publisher, had a huge empire of magazines, and she went up to him and said she'd really like to have a job. And she was a beautiful woman, and this was a different era, and he was quite skeptical that she would really want to work. And he said, well, come back and see me in 3 weeks, thinking, well, he would never see her again. But in 3 weeks, she went to his offices, and she found that he was traveling, but she saw an empty desk, and she asked, who sits there? And the other people explained it was a caption writer for the magazines who had left to marry. So she took off her coat, she sat down at the desk, and started to work. And within 3 weeks, she was on the payroll, and before you know it, she was the editor of Vanity Fair. There were no other women who edited magazines. It was remarkable. And then it was during that time that she began writing plays, and her most famous play, The Women, a wonderful play. It's still performed in community theaters. It had a run of 657 performances on Broadway starting in 1936, and then it was made into a movie twice. There was a 1939 version that was nominated for Academy Awards, and then that was redone in 2008, a modern version of it. The entire cast is women, but it's all about men. In 1947, Mrs. Luce was on the cover of Look magazine, probably one of the most widely read magazines in America. And people will say, well, what did she do? One of the things she did was during World War II, she traveled extensively in Europe as a journalist. And she was very, very concerned that Americans were not really that tuned in to the terrors of Nazism and what was going on. So she wrote a book in 1942, and it was called Europe in the Spring. And it warned Americans about what was going on, and it was an effort to try to convince Americans that the isolationism that so many of them felt so strongly while the beginning of World War II was going on was just wrong. When Dwight D. Eisenhower ran for president, she was a big supporter of him, and she gave over 100 speeches on his behalf, traveled the country for him. And when he was elected, she went to him and said, you know, there's a position in your administration I'd really like. And he said, well, what's that? And she said, I would like to be U.S. ambassador to Italy. Italy at the time was teetering between freedom and communism. This was post-World War II. It was a very difficult time, and she did a wonderful job there. They all came to have great affection for her, not only personally, but because she was so astute in her diplomatic work. Towards the end of her time, she began to feel ill, and her teeth loosened, her skin got odd, her hair fell out, and there were suspicions that the communists were somehow doing something. They tested her, and she had arsenic in her. The particles of lead paint with arsenic would fall on her morning coffee, would fall on all the surfaces, and she got arsenic poisoning. The U.S. kept it very quiet because they didn't want to embarrass Italy. They fixed the room, they repainted it, but it did serious damage to her health. And she came back and finished out some more time, but after that she left. But what a remarkable achievement to be the first woman named to a major country like that, to represent the United States, and to do it so well. Mrs. Luce was an extraordinarily attractive woman. It was said that when you met her in conversation, people were sometimes mesmerized by her beautiful eyes, and she had a habit when she was talking to you of looking at you. So many times in social situations in the professional world, the policy world, you'll be talking with someone and they look at you briefly, but then they look around for who they're going to talk to next. She never did that. She was engrossed in conversation with the people she talked with. She was beautifully dressed all the time, and we are so blessed here at Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women that her granddaughter, Clare Luce, had a couple of her dresses and a jacket that her grandmother had given her, made at Bergdorf Goodman, custom made for her. She had simple but beautiful jewelry. She was elegant without trying too hard to be elegant. It was a classical beauty. Her attentiveness when she spoke to you and looked at you, and people were captivated by her appearance as well as her depth of knowledge and her ability to express the conservative ideas that we care so much about here at Clare Boothe Luce. There was a huge, horrible event in her life that turned her more to faith. She had a daughter, Anne, who she loved dearly, was very, very close to. She also had stepsons from Henry Luce, her second husband, but she loved Anne so much, spent a lot of time with her. Anne was going to Stanford in California, a very bright young woman, and she was killed in a car crash. Mrs. Luce had just left her. They had been visiting. It was a horrible, horrible, tragic thing. And she was so distraught, of course, as any mother would be. And she turned to faith, and she actually converted to Catholicism. Then she produced her second nonfiction book. It was called Saints for Now, and she had many prominent Catholics write about their favorite saint and why, and she edited it and had it published. A wonderful book, and a wonderful monument to her towering faith, which she had for the rest of her life. She is a role model for today's young women. She had so many incredible aspects of her life: her faith, her family, her professional career, her writing, her play, being an ambassador, being a congresswoman when there were only 20. This is back in the era of our grandmothers and our great-great-grandmothers for some of the young people watching. And when she passed, she was eulogized extensively. But my favorite one was from Time magazine, who eulogized her as writer, editor, and statesman, and said, quote, "She was the preeminent Renaissance woman of the 20th century." And she was indeed.